user stories. Got it, got it. All right, so without further ado, let me pull up my presentation. I have a lot to talk to you guys about. I'm super excited. Who here has seen my videos before this session? Anybody here has been exposed to me before?
I practically stalk you.
Amazing, awesome, thank you so much. All right, so let me share my screen and let's get into this. This is informative session, hopefully. If you see me looking off to the side, that's because I have another monitor here and I'm trying to make sure I can see you guys as well as the presentation. So let's start. I think I have the right to share. So I'm going to share. You guys let me know if you're seeing my screen, okay? Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. I'm going to get this out of the way. All right. So we are talking today about user stories, right? I know that most of us are probably working in Agile, and if we're looking to start our careers, a lot of companies are working in Agile, different types of Agile. You got Agile Kanban, you got Scrum, you got Scrumban, you got all these different methodologies. But the majority of software development is being done right now in Agile Scrum. And if you're in Waterfall, you might soon hear the words, we are going Agile. So it's great for you to get exposure to this. And if you're going to be working in Agile Scrum, which is the majority of the Agile methodologies that's being used, then you want to understand user stories. You definitely want to understand what user stories are. So before I go any further, I want to find out from you guys, what are some of the questions that you have around user stories? Did anybody come prepared to find out about user stories and had questions beforehand about user stories that you want to share? Don't be shy, don't shout it all at once.
There's a question from Petra. And the question is who, what, and why?
Who, what, and why? So who writes the user story probably? Why do you use user stories? Would that be fair?
I suppose so. Oh, Petra, do you want to ask?
Okay, go ahead. Who else have a question on user stories?
So it's not a question for me. I just really want to see how we could break large requirements into smaller user stories, right?
How to break up a user story. Okay, so that's your question. Well, that's good, because guess what? That's what we're going to be talking about today, right? We're going to be talking about all of these things. Typically, I saw somebody raise their hand. Typically, there is a whole lot of questions around user stories. Who writes the user story? When do you write the user story? How do you split a user story? You know, is it the product owner? Is it the business analyst? Is it the developer? Like, how do you address changes in the sprint with the user story? So there's all of those questions I typically get. And in this presentation, we're going to go through some of that. So for those who have questions, I think that you're going to enjoy this, this session. All right. Before I get into that, though, just a little bit more about myself, for those of you who haven't been following me on YouTube or any of my other platforms. So as Kemi said, I've had over 10 years of experience working in software development. Most of that time has been spent working on Agile projects. I worked in Waterfall a little bit, and even before, you know, full Waterfall, I worked in a methodology called RUP, right? You have to be really a veteran to understand what that is. It's Rational Unified Process, which was an iterative process. It was also Agile, but it has a lot of Waterfall feel to it. So I worked in that, and then we transitioned into Agile, and I've been working in Agile for the last couple of years, and I really love it. And every time I go to a new organization, the way they do their Agile is different. So I'm always continuously learning and keeping up with the different methodologies and the thoughts in the space, because it's constantly evolving. Now we're into the concept of self-organizing teams, right? So you're on a team and everybody does everything on the team. So these are paradigm shifts that I really find interesting, and I would like to share some of that with you today. Born in Jamaica, if you hear an accent, I'm Jamaican, right? But now I live in Atlanta, Georgia. That is where I call my home for now. So you may have seen me from my YouTube channel. I have a number of videos on there, so you guys can go check out some videos if you want to learn more about the business analysis field in particular, but there's also stuff there on Agile and other software development topics, right? I also have a podcast. So if you want to be multitasking, you're in your kitchen, you're going for a walk, you can also listen to the podcast so that you can get the information while you do something else. There's a book I have that is on the Business Analyst Job Market Report. So this is a report on what employers are looking for and gives you all the things that would help you to get your next job as a business analyst. Also have a website, right? So the website has tons of good stuff. There's a template, there are courses, free courses, by the way, so you can just go and watch them. You don't have to sign up, you don't have to pay, it's just there for you. But there's one particular thing on the website I would like people who are interested in becoming business analysts to think about. It's this fit model that I've come up with. So the fit model explains the different things that you would need to have to be a good fit for the business analyst role, right? So there's a whole discussion on what business analysis is. I have several articles and videos on that. But if you're interested in becoming a business analyst, kind of what I do, there are some innate behaviors that you may have that lends itself to the role. So I have this fit model on the website, and there's a series of questions that you'll answer. You don't have to have training in business analysis. You don't need to take no course. It's just, what are you doing today that would help you to become a good fit? So you answer these questions, it's all free. And then we give you a result at the end right away. You don't have to wait for results or anything like that. The result comes and it tells you whether you're a low fit, a good fit, an excellent fit, or a perfect fit. Well, we hardly get people who are perfect fit, right? So it gives you a score between, I think it's like 1 and 360. And based on that, it tells you if you're a fit. And it also gives you some reasoning behind that. So if you're interested in the career, take advantage of these free tools that I have provided so that you can, one, know that you're going after the right career that fits your personality, and two, be able to get into this space that is growing. There's so many jobs, especially in Canada, for business analysts. And if you're trying to get into software, it's a very soft landing because you don't have to be a programmer to do this role. So just wanted to share those with you so you know that there are resources, there's help, there's assistance, there's support for those who want to get started in this very lucrative career. All right. So that being said, back to some housekeeping. I think Kemi already mentioned some of that, but pay attention to the details in this presentation, right? There's some little gotchas throughout this presentation that I want you to keep focused, right? And pay attention. So pay attention to the details, stay on mute. I think you guys are already familiar with that. There will be questions at the end, but throughout the presentation, I will be asking you to participate. And so there will be some opportunities for doing that. So that's how we will run this session. And wherever you see the slide that says, "Are you ready?" I want you guys to come off mute, jump on there and say, "Let's do it." Okay, can we practice?
Let's do it. Let's hit it. Let's hit it. Let's hit it.
Let's do it.
Do it.
All right, so we're ready. Let's go. Okay, so user stories in Jira. So the title of this presentation is How to Build User Stories in Jira. I don't really like the word build because it really feels like you're off by yourself doing something when it's really not the agile way. And even though we're going to talk about Jira, the presentation is not that much about Jira, but more about the user stories. The platform that you use, the tool that you use to be able to document the user story is less important than knowing what to do, right? So user stories in Jira, we're going to talk about what is a user story, right? What makes a good user story? And by definition of that, then you know what makes a bad user story. How to write the user stories, right? Who writes them? When do they write them? And how do you split a user story? There's one more thing here that I didn't talk about, which is how do you break up a big feature into user stories? What is the mechanism that you use? How do you divide something huge and unsurmountable into small pieces that the development team can take and build and be a part of an increment that will then be possibly released to your customers for the companies that you're working for, right? So there's all of that, right? So are you ready?
Let's do
Let's
it.
do it.
Yes.
Let's do it.
Pay attention to the details.
Let's do it.
I'll give you some grace because you got to take time to come off mute, so that's fine. So what is a user story? How many of you thought that a user story was a part of Agile Scrum? I bet a lot of you did, right? So most people think that user stories come from Scrum, is a part of Agile. Some people don't even know what Agile is. Seems to be this big blob of things and words that people are saying, but understanding what it really means is not always true. So user stories is a term that was coined by this guy called Kent Beck, and it was from one of those Agile methodologies called extreme programming. So extreme programming all of these methodologies came about kind of the same time, right? So in the late 80s and into the 90s, we really had a problem in the world of software. The problem was that we were handling software like projects. So there's a time and an end, there's a specific project team. And when the project was over, the team disbands. And God help you trying to find out why they made the decisions that they made, because everybody's all over the place. And then software projects were constantly coming in over budget, not within scope, just completely a mess, and never really fulfilled the purpose of which it was intended. Like the clients were not fulfilled. What they delivered was not what they thought at the beginning. And it was just hard to manage a software project. Not only that, but as you spend a year or so building the software, technology has passed you. And now you build something that's almost obsolete. So the challenges around software development gave rise to Agile, right? So this is just a little precursor to Agile before we get into user stories. So in the late 80s, early 90s, a number of methodologies came up because developers came together and said, we have to solve this. We cannot continue working like this. This is not going to be sustainable. And they came up with a number of things. There was rope, there was extreme programming, there was a whole number of other things. By 2001, they all came together and came up with a manifesto. And the manifesto was just the guiding principles of what they will live by in order to build software in an agile way. And then the multiple methodologies, eventually one or two of them became very popular, which is Kanban and Scrum. And so Scrum became the leader in Agile, and Scrum has a number of things, including user stories, which people associate to Scrum, but it really didn't come from Scrum, right? But you hear about user stories a lot. You hear about sprints, you hear about backlog, you hear about daily Scrum, which is like the stand-up. You hear about sprint reviews. There's all these buzzwords that you hear, and it all comes together to help you to deliver software faster, more on time, more efficiently. So the whole process has just been great, and that is why it took off, because now you can deliver things in increments, validate that they actually work, then go off and build the rest, as opposed to building the whole thing up front like we did Waterfall, and at the end, nobody was happy. So that's kind of where the whole Agile process came from. And a part of that in the beginning was this methodology called extreme programming. And this guy, Kent Beck, he had cards at the time, and he would write the user story on a card, right? The idea was, here's a small piece of functionality that we're going to talk about, and we're going to understand it very well, and we're going to know what we're going to build when we're done. And the point of it eventually came off cards and went onto sticky notes. But the reason why it was so good was because it's just the size of the paper, right? It's small. It's not a whole big requirements document with a bunch of interrelated things that you can't fathom at once. It's a small thing, which means you can't put a lot of paragraphs on it because it won't fit. So you are forced to write something small that they can talk about. And you know what? If it doesn't work, no more value, you throw it away and you do something else, right? So it was very temporary, right? So the idea was, here's a small functionality we're going to discuss. We're going to see if it has value before we go build it. And then if it doesn't have value, we throw it away and come up with something else. If it does, we go ahead and we all walk away knowing what to build. The thing about user stories is that even though this talk is about writing user stories are really something you talk about. It's a discussion point. It's something to get the team to rally around and talk about it. Because once you talk about something, it leaves a mental picture in your brain. That way you walk away, everybody understands what they need to build, right? There is no, I read something and I understood it differently, somebody else read something else. The problem with requirements documents is that you have to be so meticulous in how you write them so that the people can understand the writing. But what about if you just talked, right? You talk, it's easier, you get things done faster, it's more efficient. So the whole point of the user story is to facilitate the talking, right? It's a conversation starter. It's not you sit in your corner, write a user story, throw it over the wall, and you're done. If you're doing that, you're not doing Agile. You're doing something else. You're doing a waterfall process using an agile tool, right? You're not supposed to be writing user stories and then handing it off and being done with it. That's not what it is. It's a conversation starter. So it's small chunks of functionality that provides a benefit to the user. Small things. As a user, I want to be able to click on the login button or be able to log into an application. I want to be able to get my credit score results. I want to be able to apply for a loan online. Like, these are just things that, yes, it warrants more discussion to flesh it out, but it tells you this is a value that they get from doing this, right? So that's the reason why we have the so that part of the user story, which I'm sure most of you know. So while the user personas highlight who the users are, the user story talks about what they do. So it's really the actions that they can take, right? So that's where we got user stories from. We can attribute it back to extreme programming and this guy called Kent Beck, not Scrum, as we thought. All right, so what makes a good user story? So if we know that user stories are a conversation piece, and we know that we're not supposed to write them and throw them over the wall, what exactly makes a good user story? Great question, glad you asked. So good user stories are talked about. It's a conversation, it's not a written piece of paper. It's talked about, not written. Now, obviously you're gonna write it at some point because you have to keep log of what you're doing or what you're building. So there is writing happening. But the writing is not your focus. And I can't stress this enough because I've seen so many people get hung up on writing user stories. What's the format? How do you put the story together? You're really supposed to be having a conversation with your team, right? That is the point of having a user story. And if you're doing anything else, you're not doing Agile. So what makes a good user story? Well, a good user story is discussed with the team. Who is the team? So if you're in Agile Scrum, there's only 3 roles, right? There is a product owner, there is a Scrum Master, and then there's what we call development team. Now, development team doesn't mean it's only software engineers. It means this is a team that's really individually contributing to the process, right, to the sprint goal. So when you're discussing your user stories, you need to have all those people in the room. So you might have your QA in the room, you have your developers in the room, you have your architects, you have your product owner, the Scrum Master, you as the business analyst. You're all talking about this story, and this is why you have your sprint planning, because everybody needs to walk away from that meeting knowing what they need to build, right? The story is the focal point, it's the focus, but it's a discussion, and you should be changing the acceptance criteria, which we'll talk about in a minute. You're changing the acceptance criteria based on the discussion that you're having around the story. If you're writing the story, coming up with all the acceptance criteria, and then in the sprint planning, you don't want to change because you've already written it, then you're doing it wrong. The team comes up with the acceptance criteria. The team decides what's the definition of done. And the team includes all of these people, right? So it's a discussion point. Again, I'm just going to keep saying it the whole night. When you leave here, the one thing you know is that your user story is a discussion. It's not a written piece of paper, okay? The user story must focus on the user. User story has to have a benefit to the user, meaning you're not writing stories that benefit the system. You're not writing stories that benefit the back end, the manager, the company. It's really, what does the user, how does you benefit from this? So back in the day, right, we used to write requirements for everything. Some things were just nice to have. It just sounded like a great idea. Or the VP or the executive thought, we need to do this in the product. And then you just ended up in the product. And nobody was thinking about who's actually going to use this, right? And is this a good value add? Is this more features doesn't mean better software. Otherwise, you become what we call a feature factory, where you're just brainstorming new features, building features, shipping features, brainstorm features, build features, ship features. What's wrong with that picture? What's wrong with it is that you don't know if the user is using it. You don't know if it's bringing value. You're just adding stuff because stuff can be added. We don't want to do that. We want to add things that really bring value. People only use our software because it's solving a problem for them. If they don't have a problem, what are you solving for, right? If it's not a pain that they're feeling, they're not going to use it. Think about your Word. I always like to use my Word example. I talk about this a lot in my videos, where when I open Microsoft Word, well, now they've kind of changed it a little to hide some things. But when I used to open Microsoft Word, there was just a bunch of menu options, like a bunch of stuff. Do I use all of those stuff? not every day, for sure. Like I'm not creating macros necessarily in Word. I'm not doing a whole bunch of stuff. So I don't need all those features. If you're going to be like a power user, or if you're going to be, creating books and all these other things, maybe you need to use everything in there. But there could have been a smaller slice of Word long time ago. Now they have Office 365 that kind of minimizes it. But there could have been a smaller slice that they could have released to the market. God knows how long they took to build that, and God knows how much money it cost them. But were all those features really necessary? Right? Were those really pain points that you were solving, or was it just a bunch of nice to haves? So you need to make sure the user story is focused on the user. Now, as a business analyst, you may not have the sole responsibility for that. It may be coming down to you through the product manager, the product owner, and they prioritize the backlog and decide on what gets built. But it is your job to make sure you push back where you see that you're building things that are not actually helping the user. You need to understand the user very well. You need to have the user's journey in mind. Where's the user going? So you may be the only person on the team that's going to help guide the team into what's beneficial for the user. So a user story has to be focusing on the user and have benefit to the user. The user story must be visible to the team. What does that mean? Back in the day, people used to write these elaborate requirement documents, right? It was fantastic, big documents with all kinds of requirements, and you had all kinds of sections. It was great. You had to, like take a course to know where to find things. Right? You open the table of contents, so you had to be clicking around trying to figure out where is what. And that big, wonderful document was hidden in some SharePoint folder somewhere under some drive that only certain people could access. So you never really knew what were all the things that you needed to do. Right? So the user story being visible means that you should be able to share this with the team. The team should be able to see everything at once. Like they should be able to go in there and see, okay, these are all the things that we need to build for this feature or for this project or this release, whatever. It needs to be visible. That way everybody can have eyes on it. Everybody can discuss it. Everybody can see where there's a flaw or there's a problem. When you hide it, it becomes like, oh, I didn't know we had to do that too. I didn't know about that. And so now you have more challenges that you need to have, right? So user story must be visible. And that's why people like Jira, because now you can go in and see a whole backlog of things and you know exactly what the prioritizations are. So good user stories have acceptance criteria that's testable, right? So you write your acceptance criteria for the testing. This is your definition of done. It's also just how you confirm that the user story is accomplished. So you need to make sure the user story has testable acceptance criteria. If you're writing a story, for example, that is a backend story, just have API calls and it's just, there's no interface or anything like that. How do you test it? How do you confirm it's working? Well, they have to find a way to test it. Otherwise, it's not a good user story. Either they're going to create some temporary screen that shows the result, or it has to be demonstrable. You have to show it. You have to be able to test and see that it's working. You can't say, oh yeah, I believe the developer because he said it worked, right? The user story must be testable. So it must be short and concise. This is the reason why you have the sticky pad as representative of the user story, because it fits on this as a space, right? It's not a long, big epistle with paragraph upon paragraph. Nobody wants to read all that because you can't process all of that at once, right? So you're forced to make it small, make it short, make it concise, so that the developers can estimate it. They can think through it properly because it's not so convoluted. The user story focuses on the problem to solve, not the feature to build. Like I said before, you don't want to become a feature factory, just churning out features. That's not what you want to be. You want to be solving real world problems. So your user stories should be focusing on the problem that you're solving and not the functionality and the feature and how the system behaves. And you can get very tied down in because you're so focused on that, because that's your world every day. And you can easily lose sight of the customer who's consuming whatever you're putting out there. They don't have the background of the system. How is this helping them solve an everyday problem? How does your consumers, the people who are going to be using your software, actually work? What is their world like? And are you actually helping them? You got to focus on that. So if you don't find value in the user story anymore, please remove the user story from your backlog, right? Do not become a user story hoarder. What do I mean by this? I mean, I've seen backlogs that are like lists, like 3-4 years worth of work that's just there. been there for a while, keeps going there. Nobody's prioritizing them. Nobody's paying attention to them because they probably haven't gotten to them. At some point, they were valuable at the time. And then something else became more prioritized over that, and it just kept falling lower and lower in the backlog, but nobody wants to remove it. People are very, very attached to user stories that they write. They're very attached to the fact that there was some work done in there. There's probably, designs in there. There's probably comments and stuff that they think is helpful. But if you're not gonna build the story, there's no need to have a user story in your backlog for years and years. It doesn't make any sense. So either you're going to delete it altogether, which people are very scared of deleting stuff, or you're going to move it to a different project that you're not looking at, or you're going to create a new status that says close and get rid of it that way, or something like that. But remove things that you're not using, remove things that are no longer valuable, so you can focus on the things that are of value that you need to be working on, right? So those are what makes a good user story. So since we know what makes a good user story, people, most people use this invest to explain what a good user story is. Does anyone know, anyone here know what the invest stands for? Can anyone tell me? Invest. It's an acronym. Does anyone know what the acronym stands for? No? Okay.
Yes, I do.
Okay, go ahead. You're almost
Independent,
huh?
negotiable,
Yes.
valuable,
Huh.
estimable, small, and testable.
There you go. Woohoo! Awesome, awesome. Very good. Yes. So this is what the invest means. Independent means that there's not a lot of dependencies. I'll talk about what that means in the real world in a minute. Negotiable, before you write a requirement and that was it. It's in the logs, it's written in the requirements document, and you dare not change it, because the project manager gets all upset and they agree to this requirement and the client is expecting this, and it's written at the beginning of the project and nobody dare look at it again. Nobody change it. And if you want to change, there's a whole change management process. You got to ask this manager and that manager. You got to sign off 1 million documents. It was very, very locked down. So the user story should be the opposite of that, right? It's negotiable, which means I write it as a discussion, which means I want to change it. I want to improve it. I want to get feedback on it. And if I get feedback, then I change it. I leverage the team's knowledge to make the best decisions around what we should build, and not one person in silo with some authority like the project manager. They know the best thing, or the business analyst working alongside the project manager decide what the user story is and passes it down to Deb and say, you just build that. Your job is just to build, right? No, it's more, here's the thought, here's the idea. Let's talk about it together, and everybody inputs, and together we refine what this requirement or user story is. So that's why it's negotiable. You can talk about it, you can change it. Valuable, we talked about this just now. Value to the user. Who is benefiting from this user story? What is the benefit that they get, right? So if they're not getting a benefit, why are you building it, right? You're building a feature that's great, but are they going to use it? Is it a part of their use case? Is it a part of their journey? I mean, why would you build this? Estimatable, small enough. It goes along with the S, which means small, which means it's so small that you can quickly estimate how much story points or whatever you use to estimate, days, man hours, whatever. You can estimate how long it's going to take to build because it's small enough for you to conceptualize it and put it together, in your head. So that's small and estimatable together. And then testable. At the end of it, you have to show how the user story was implemented. You have to demo it. It has to be shown somehow. It has to be tested. So that's what the invest is. This is a typical thing that you always find when you're looking about what a good user story is. But in the real world, we challenge everything, right? In the real world, nobody is going by the book. In the real world, people are doing what works for them. Companies are doing what works for them. That's why they're agile. It means that they can flex and they can bend. You own your methodology. You do not rent your methodology. So when you own your home, you can go pull out a wall and put up colors and, build a whole backyard, put hardscape and, all kinds of stuff, landscaping. You can do whatever you want because it's your house. But when you rent, you got to stay in the confines of the rules that the landlord gives you, right? You can't do this to the wall, you can't paint the color, all these restrictions are on you. So similarly with your methodology for your company, you own that methodology. So you can change it, you can make it work for you and your environment at will. There's no reason to stick to any book when it comes to Agile methodology. So here is what the book says about good user stories. However, there are some caveats that I want to point out here. So even though it says independent, that does not mean that you won't have user stories that are dependent. What it really means by independent is that you're not going to create user stories that have so much linkages, that have so much dependencies between each other, that it's very difficult to think about one without the other, right? So you're going to minimize the amount of dependencies that you have. So for example, if you're creating a user story for building a loan application system, you create a user story separate for the login process, one separate for calling the credit bureau to get the credit score, one separate for displaying that and having the user maybe upload some other qualifying documentation. So they're all kind of separate. So if I was a developer, I can go build my login screen and somebody else can go build my, call it the API for the credit score. And I don't really have to wait for this person to be done to do my thing, so that we can work in parallel, right? So once you make it kind of self-contained, it's independent and you can do that. That doesn't mean you don't have dependencies, because it could be that you need the user to upload these documents before you can call the credit score, right? So there's a dependency. This one causes this one is blocked by this one. Jira actually has built into it ways to show dependencies. So it would defy what they say is a good user story, right? That it's independent, because it's not really true. In the real world, there are dependencies, but as you're writing, as a best practice, as you're writing user stories, you try to make them as self-contained as possible, as independent as possible. You never have a project where there's no dependencies at all, right? So that's where that's concerned. So negotiable, talk about being able to talk about the story and change it as we want and do all that stuff. That's true, except when you're in the sprint, right? So if you have an understanding of sprints, it's this block of time that we have committed to building these things. So there's a whole sprint plan. I'll have a discussion on Scrum on my channel where I talk about the whole Scrum process and all the Scrum ceremonies. So you can watch that. But just for now, in Agile, we have this concept where we pick a bunch of stories, we prioritize them, we talk about them, and we say, okay, for 2 weeks, we are dedicated to building this thing, these things, right? And we're not changing. We don't want anything new to come in. And we're probably not going to take anything out unless it's really dire. And this is what we're focused on. And we're going to, at the end of it, we're going to demo everything we've built. And if there's changes, we make those later, right? So that's the focus. So typically your sprint for those 2 weeks is locked down. So it's no longer negotiable, right? It's negotiable up till you get to the sprint planning. But once you put it in the sprint and say, this is it, typically you don't change after that, right? So it's not negotiable most of the time when it's already in a sprint. Valuable. So the user story has to be valuable to the end user, except for some backend stories, right? So there's always an exception. What do I mean by backend stories? I mean, sorry, go ahead. No? Okay. What do I mean by backend stories? I mean that if you have a story where it's just system to system, like it's an API call, like it's something that's just happening in the back where there's no front-end interface, typically, we always want our user stories to be beneficial to the user, but there could be stories that does not actually have a front end like a user benefit. Like for example, two-factor authentication. Two-factor authentication is where I need to put something in my phone as well as something on my email or whatever the two factors are. It really doesn't benefit me as much. Yes, you're trying to protect me, but it's really protecting the system from being hacked. Right? It's not really benefiting me as a user. So there's some things, backend stories and that example, the two factors authentication, that doesn't always benefit the user, but for the most part, the majority of the time, you are trying to write user stories that benefit the user. Estimatable, except for spike stories. So what do I mean by spike story? Spike stories are stories where I don't really know how to do it. I don't know. For example, let's say I'm trying to I'm calling a third-party system in my software, right? Let's say I need to call the third party and I need to, parse some data that they send me. but I don't know how they send the data. I don't know how to call their API. I just don't know. Nobody in the room knows. Nobody in the team knows. The developers don't know. The product owner doesn't know. The business analyst doesn't know. Nobody knows. So, but we know we have to do it, right? But the only thing we are sure of is that it has to be done the exact way that you do it. They don't know, so they can't estimate how much effort it will take because they don't really know. So in those situations, we create what we call a spike story. It's just a user story that we don't estimate, and we give it a time box to say, okay, go research how to call this API from this third-party system, for example. And I'm going to give you 2 days to focus on that, right? And the acceptance criteria is typically very generic because we don't really know what we're going to get. Or it could be where, let's say we're trying to build some graph. Let's say we're building a pie chart, not a pie chart, like a table, right? And there's some visualization chart that we're building on top of it. And we don't really know what library would be best. We could use any chart, we could use some other chart, we could use Domo, we could use Looker, we could use any kind of thing. So we create a spike story that says, go research the best tool to use to create this chart. Now we don't know what the result will be, right? So the developer goes off, he researches it because he has the most back-end knowledge to know what interface it can work with, what APIs to call, all that detail. So he goes off, he researches it, and the end of that spike story is he presents to us, okay, I think based on my research, the best thing to do is to install this thing called Domo reports that I can build my own visualization on top of the data, right? So the spike story is not estimatable, right? So we just talked about a good user story is estimatable. Well, if it's a spike story, we can't estimate it because we don't know what we don't know. So that's an example of how it works in the real world. Small, so the user story must be small, but it can't be too small, right? So in my example with the login, you want to use a story where you can enter your login, you can do the forgotten password, you can send them an email when they're finished logging in or they're logged in successfully or something like that. You don't want to use, so that's a whole body of things in one user story. So it's small enough to be completed in one user story and not too big so it doesn't become hard to estimate. But if you were to use a story to say the user must see a button that says login, too small. That's just like a 1-point story like that. It's too minute. So you don't want it to be too small because that way it doesn't take anything for developers to do and the user story almost is meaningless, but you don't want it to be too big. So there's a skill that you only learn by doing. Nobody can tell you exactly when it's going to be too small or too big. You're kind of going to have to gauge it. And as you go, that is why you're having the conversation. This is why you're not going to write the user story and throw it over the wall. You're going to make a stab at it. You're going to go into the discussion with your team and say, hey, this is what, you're not going to say, hey, but like, this is what you're going to present to them. And together they'll say, you know, Karaleise, I think the story is too small. Why don't we add the forgotten password flow in there? Why don't we add being able to send the email? I think that's good enough for one story, or we can give it a 5-story point or something like that, right? So the team will help you with knowing what is the right level of detail. It's a team effort. It's a discussion. It's the reason why it's great is because everybody adds to it. And in that way, we always end up getting a better result because everybody had eyes and they could all see it. They could all talk about it. They all understood what they're trying to build and they all together refine it. That's the benefit. Testable, you got to test it. You got to test it. No matter what you're building, you have to be able to show it. It must be demonstrable. If it's a backend data from this point to that point, and you're just transferring data, find a way to test that, right? If it's to show it on some screen, it's to create a temporary screen. Something has to show that this user story was done, okay? That's the things that happen in the real world versus what they tell you in the books. So just wanted to call those things out. All right, so good user stories have acceptance criteria. There is no way you can write a user story and then that's it. As a user, I want to be able to log in so that I can see my data and you're done. The acceptance criteria needs to be there. When the user clicks on this button, they should open to this page. The user should be able to do so and so. So it has to have the steps, the acceptance criteria, the definition of done to confirm that that user story was actually accomplished, right? So that's the other thing about good user stories. So now that we've talked about what makes a good user story, what makes a bad user story? I think that would be the opposite, right? I think you guys would probably know that. So if having a discussion is making it good, then not having a discussion make it a bad story, right? Write in the user story in Jira, having the product owner put it in the sprint, and then having the sprint planning where nobody is actually discussing the story, it's just like thrown over the wall. It's not the best way to do it, not best practice. If your user story prescribes technology, that is also not best practice. What do I mean by this? I mean, if you're writing your user story to say that you're using HTML5 versus JSON, or you're using React library, or whatever the technology is that you're using, that has no place in your user story. Why? Because your user story has to be detached from the technology. The user story is benefit to the user. The user doesn't care about the technology that you use. They want to accomplish some benefit for some problem they're trying to solve. So your user story needs to be focused on the user and this problem they're solving, not the details of the technology that they're using. Now, I know some people will say, well, Karaleise, what if that's a part of the user, the whole project changes technology? Well, that's fine. If that's the case, then okay. But as a rule, in general, you're not tying the user story to the technology. Dictating UI elements. The user story should not be dictating UI elements. What do I mean by UI elements? I mean, the screen must have a button that is green with the words submit, right? So this is a common problem that people like to put exactly what the screen looks like. The best practice is that there is a style guide, right? Or there is a pattern that, you know, the whole application will conform to. So you don't need to specify what a button looks like, because they will already have the style guide that tells you this is how a button looks like, this is how a modal looks, this is how the, you know, the screen's shape, and there should be some pattern. So the screens are not changing screen to screen. That would be bad. That would be bad UI, by the way. So the user story should assume that you already have this pattern. And if you want to refer to it in the user story, you can do that. If you want to link to some documentation that talks about that, that's fine. But you shouldn't have to change your user story because they change the color from blue to green, right? It should really be a pattern that you're following. And if you don't have that pattern everywhere, that's fine. You can probably make that addition to your user story. But as a general rule, the best practice is not to couple the user story with the UI. So that if they change it from a button to a drop list, doesn't matter. You write, as you know, the user should be able to see an option to submit. You say an option. So if they make it option a button, they make it a drop down, a checkbox, a radio, whatever they make it, doesn't matter, because the user story is just that they have the ability to, for example, submit. Again, you're going back to the value to the user. Right? The user really doesn't care if you give them a button versus a radio button or a drop down. They don't care. They want to be able to do the action and get the result that they're trying to get. Again, the user story must not be focused on a feature. It must be focused on the problem. And the user story should not be tasks to execute. So as a user, I want to be able to make my loan application, and then there's a bunch of tasks. Right? So it's really not tasks that they're trying to do, it's what's the value that they're getting, right? So you need to make that mindset shift. And one more note on tasks. So in Jira, and I'll show you in a minute, there's different types of items or issue type, right? So you have user stories, which are typically new enhancements, new features that you're trying to build into your software. There are bugs. So you build something and then, you know, there's a defect, there's a bug, so you create a bug. Then there are tasks and subtasks. So it's perfectly fine to make tasks in Jira just items to do, like dev backend stuff. That's perfectly fine. But the user story is a little bit different from the task. There's a distinction in Jira about that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So the user story format doesn't have to be used for everything in your backlog, right? So you don't have to make everything in a user story format. So your bugs are in user story format. As a user, I don't want this bug for whatever reason, right? You don't need to. The bug can have its own format. The task can have its own format. The user story, though, should have a user story format. The user story should not be huge. So if you're finding it writing paragraph upon paragraph upon paragraph, you know that it's way too big. So the length of the words that you're using could indicate the size. Also, if you find your development team saying they don't understand, they need you to break it down for them, that's also an indication that you've made it too big and you need to split it somehow. Or if they give you a huge estimate, like the ticket is like 20 story points or something big, you know that, okay, this is way too big, I need to split it. Or if you write, it could just be a line that you write, but involved in that line, just one sentence, is just a whole bunch of stuff. For example, as a user, must be able to check out my cart. What? That's your user story. That's way too big, because checkout involves all kinds of stuff. You need to call the credit card API to make sure the money is there. You need to show them that, you know, when the items are going to be delivered. You need to have the right address and date. There's so many things in this checkout process that you can't just write one user story for checking out. That's way too big, right? So it's not only the number of words that make it big, but just the concepts that's involved in maybe even one or a few words, okay? If the user story cannot be tested, you already know what I'm gonna say. It's not a good user story. It has to be tested. So that's what's make a bad user story. Now, how to write user story? I'm watching the time. I know we're out of time, but I'll go through a little bit more, and then we'll have some time for questions, I hope, at the end. So how to write user stories in Jira, okay? So Jira, right? Who doesn't know Jira? Jira is the #1 software that teams are using when they're doing Agile, right? So it's a very popular software. Almost every company doing Agile is using it, and typically they use it for Agile Scrum or Kanban. So it's highly beneficial to know Jira, and you can get a free version. You can get a free version and just play around with it. It's you know, I think it's free for like 10 people on a team or something. So it's pretty good. Most companies are using this, so it'd be great to get your hands wet in this. So when you create a new user story, they give you this screen, right? And it's just a screenshot from one of my other projects. And if you notice, it doesn't have anything in there. It's literally blank. You can put whatever you like inside of a user story. By the way, this little green icon represents user story, and the other icons represent other types of issues in Jira. Jira actually came from an issue management, like a defect management system, and eventually became the #1 system for Agile. So they've really scoped and grown. Now they have roadmaps in Jira. They have all kinds of stuff, multiple different types of projects. So it's really been a very extensive tool. You can also add, like, I have a video on this where you can add these apps into Jira, so that if you have a design, you don't have to keep screenshotting and uploading the screenshot. You can just use the app and, you know, embed the screenshot, so that when the design changes, you don't have to change your story, because the embedded design is always updating. So in this case, I have InVision, I have Actia, I have Marvel app. Some people use Figma or Zeppelin for their designs. All of that is possible in Jira. It makes it very, very extensible, very, very good to use. So the point I'm making here is that you have this blank screen. Literally write whatever you want. Doesn't mean that you should, right? It doesn't, because it doesn't enforce a format, doesn't mean that you should do whatever you like. You really should stick to the format that we all know, which is this format right here for writing user stories. So as a type of user, as an admin, as a follower, as a, you know, as a CS manager, whatever, right? As this type of user, I want this feature so I can have this benefit. Don't forget the so that part. Don't forget that, because that's going to show you the value that this thing has to the user. So as a user, or the type of user, I want this feature so I can have this benefit. And then you can put some additional detail in your user story. So you can say, okay, you know, we're going to just build the UI piece of this, and the others will be additional stories, or whatever message that you want the team to know, you put it in there. Yes, you're going to discuss it with the team, but it's also just something that could come out after your discussions as well. And you want to document it for future purposes. And then you have your acceptance criteria, which is, now that you've presented the story, the whole team has talked about it, the team together came up with how we're going to make sure that this is done, and they came up with ideas around acceptance criteria. You document it here, and that's your story. So you got your user story piece, you've got any notes you need, and then you have all of the things that you've agreed to as a team to test that the user story is accomplished, right? This format, I took it from Richard Kaporowski, which is a Harvard University professor, and came up with this for one of those apps I was using. So yeah. So yeah, here's another one, kind of the same template feature. So you have, this one is using Jerkin format. So the different formats are writing user stories, right? So this one is BDD, behavioral driven development, where it's based on what are you doing when this happens, and here's an action, right? So after you have, as a user, I want to perform some tasks so that I can get this goal. Your acceptance criteria could be written like this, which says, given that I'm in some place, or given I'm on the home screen, given that I have just uploaded my documents, given this condition, like this context, when I do this action, then the system behaves this way. Right? This is the result that I get. So you can also write user stories in that format. So you have this format, which is more like a test-driven design. So it's just like basically here are the things that we're going to test for. And then you have this format, which is here's the behavior that is driving, making sure that this user story is actually being delivered, right? So those are the two formats that is common. So test-driven and jerking are the main ones, but you can come up with your own. Remember, you own your methodology. You don't have to rent it and use whatever somebody else is doing. You can create your own custom. Once your team understands what you're saying and the team has agreed to it, you can come up with your own format, right? So literally, well, before I get to that, so here's an example of a jerking format user story. So this one talks about user authentication. So given the user is already registered to the website, the user is on the login page, sorry. When the user inputs the correct email address and the user inputs the correct password and the user clicks the login button, then the user should be authenticated. Right, so given this scenario and you've done these actions, then this is the result. And the user should be redirected to their dashboard and the user should be presented with a success message. So here's an example using jerking format. Here's another example using test-driven or your custom format. So the system must display a login page with the following options: email address, password, login button. Notice I'm not specifying too much detail. It probably shouldn't say button should be login option because it could be a button or something else. When the user clicks the login button, again, we'll take that out, the system must authenticate the user, verifying the email address and password. If the login details, email address and password, matches a registered user, then the system must present a success message and display their dashboard. So you could write, right? So this is another way that you could have written it. Now, looking at this format, I want you to catch something. I told you to pay attention. I hope you guys are paying attention. So this system, this user story handled being able to register or being able to log in. So who caught what was missing in that user story? Gotta pay attention, right? I'm gonna catch you when you're not paying attention. So
the value it's providing to the customer.
Yeah, well, it didn't have the user story part of it. That's true. That's one part. But there's something else very important that it missed. There's something very important from this.
So that part.
Yes, that part, I agree. That part is missing because I didn't put the actual user story. I'm putting the acceptance criteria for the user story. So that's true. But there's something in the acceptance criteria that's missing. I'll tell you for the interest of time. So what's missing is, well, before that, oh, I don't have it here. What's missing is that you don't have the flow for if it's not successful. What about the unhappy path? So you talk about what happens if it matches a registered user. What if it didn't match? What does the system do? There's no recourse. There's no behavior that's specified. So if you didn't match, you couldn't register, what happens? So you always make sure that you've thought through all the scenarios, okay? What if it didn't go well? Then what happens? Maybe sometimes you got to make a separate user story for that, but sometimes it could just be a part of the existing user story and the team will help you do that. But be careful to not just write user stories for the happy path is the point. Make sure you're covering both scenarios, right? That's what was missing here. I should have had a slide on that. So in the end though, right? You quack me up because nobody cares about your format. Nobody cares. If you're following this book that says you need to write it in TDD, you need to write it in BDD and blah, 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 that's great for the book and the authors of the book. When you get into the job, nobody cares about your format. What they care about is, do they understand what they need to build? Did you provide the clarity for what they need to build? Did you bring the team together to discuss what they need to build for them to walk away knowing all the details behind it, right? Nobody's watching your format and nobody really cares about what exact format you're using. It's the truth. So when do you write the user story? When do you write the user story? So you write the user stories after you've had the discussion. I know. You're gonna say, well, you have to write the user story before so that the product owner can prioritize it and all that stuff. I get it, that's true. So you write the user story, the product owner prioritizes it, but the story isn't done. It's not really, it's something to use to organize the backlog, But really, it's in sprint planning that you go in there and they talk about it and you make all the changes and make sure you clarify what needs to be done, right? So don't see your user story as this final thing that, okay, I've done, my hands are washed of it, because it's not the truth. Okay, so after you have to discuss it, or it's not true Agile. Who writes the user story? Who writes the user story? It's a big discussion in the community between the developer and the product owner, and who writes the user story, because there is a skill. There's a skill applied to writing user stories that are clear. I have seen some bad user stories in my life. I've seen user stories that are just paragraphs. I've seen things that by the time you get to the end, it contradicts the beginning and you don't really know what you're supposed to build. It's a whole big discussion because it was not clear. So who writes it? Well, the person who should write the user story really should be the person who has the best understanding of the use case. They understand what they're trying to build. They understand the problem they're trying to solve. And typically that person is the business analyst if you have one on the team. Because Scrum doesn't have a business analyst role specifically, we're kind of blended into the development team. It really puts teams that don't have a business analyst at a disadvantage, because we bring a skill that not everybody has. We know how to elicit requirements. We know how to change those requirements into actual small chunks. We know how to convert those into user stories. We know how to bring the team together to talk about it. We know how to translate between development team and the business. Most companies don't realize they need that skill because they look at the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Guide says developers, Scrum Master, product owner, they go off and hire for those roles, and they leave out the business analyst, which is the most important role, I believe, to pull everything together. When you're missing the business analyst, you're missing that skill that really could help your team. So where you have a business analyst in the team, they write the user story. Where you don't have a business analyst, the product owner writes the user story. What you don't want to do is have developers writing user stories. It's just not best practice, because the developers are very skilled at knowing how to do something, how to build this, what code to write, what libraries to call, how to do their PRs, how to push this to production. They're very good at all that stuff. They don't really have the same connection to the business to really be able to figure out what to build and then how to build it. We need to provide the clarity as to what to build, and they can focus, and they're very good at this, focus on how to build it. And so the two work very well together. When you force your developers to write what and then force them to go build it, then it doesn't work well. So you don't really want that to happen. So let's go back to Jira. So we have these types of issues in Jira, right? We got our stories, we got our bugs, we got our epics, we got our tasks and our subtasks. So typically, the business analyst or the product owner is writing the user story at this level. We also write epics because sometimes the epic is intended to be the feature, the bigger picture. So the epic is a collection of user stories that have something in common. So I could be building, I like to go back to my banking example. I could be building a loan application system, and I might have a section on, benefit, maybe loan processing, like the back end part of it, loan processing, and that's an epic. But under that are all these different things: calling the credit bureau, getting the FICO score, sending out the letters that need to go automatically. All these different things might boil up to my loan processing epic. And so the epic tends to have at a higher level and has stories below it. So business analysts and product owners are writing epics and they're writing user stories. The bugs are typically written by QA. So the QA has tested and they found that it doesn't really meet the acceptance criteria. They create a bug, and the bug does not have to be in the user story format. If they want to, it's fine, but it doesn't have to be a user story format. It tends to be in a jerkin format, which says, here's what happened. These are the actions I took, and this is the result I got. But what I expected was this. So you normally have an expected result and an actual result to show the difference and to help a developer troubleshoot, right? So QA is writing bugs. Dev can write as much tasks and as much subtasks as they want. We don't really worry about these because these are small things that they have to do to accomplish user story. So maybe they need to create a new API. They need to send this thing to some server somewhere, and all of these little things, little tasks they have to do. All of these things should boil up to a user story though. You shouldn't be going off creating tasks that are isolated by themselves. Every task should be helping you get to a user story. So that's how the Jira types should work. So are you ready?
Let's do it.
Yes.
Let's do
do
it.
it.
Let's do it.
Let's do it.
Come on, do it.
I want you to think about this. Think about this problem. So if you are given this screen and you are hired as a business analyst, how would you write a user story for creating a Facebook post? How would you break this up into user stories? What user stories would you create? So let's say you work on the team, you're working at Facebook, and they gave you the screenshot and said, okay, we went through our process. Our UX designers came up with this screen and said, this is the best thing for creating a post. And now we hand it over to you and we say, right, convert this into a way it can be implemented. So you have to write user stories to give your development team. How would you write it? What would you put in it? And what would be the first things you think about? I'll give you a minute, and then I'll see who wants to take a stab at it. In the meantime, let me look at the chat and see what's going on in this chat right here.
Yeah, we have some questions on the chat box already.
Yeah, I'm gonna get to them. So, yeah, let's talk about this user story. So, who wants to make a stab? Let's go back. Who wants to make a stab at how they would create this user story? All it is just this create post. You have the user who's logged in. You have this public. You have just this placeholder text that says, writing your post. Then you have add to post and these icons right here and this color thing. How would you write this as a user story? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Sure, I'll take a stab.
Right, let's go.
As a user, I want to write text to create a post so that I can create a post or post a post.
So you would be what type of user?
I would be considered a regular Facebook user.
Registered user.
Yes, a registered user. You could say as a user generally, because in the context of the company, they'll know what a user is. But you at some point, you'd have to say that you're logged in to be able to see that, right? So part of the acceptance criteria would be that you'd have to already be logged in so that they can show your name here, right? So, okay, so that's your user story. Now, what is your acceptance criteria? Or many people, anybody wants to jump in and help her out with this, that's fine. What would be the acceptance criteria?
Given that I'm logged in as a user, when I navigate to my front page, the system should display an empty text box.
Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. Anybody else want to try?
We have a couple of comments in the chat box.
Yeah, somebody raise your hand. Let's see. I wanna see who. Okay. Can we? I don't know how to do this. Do I ask to unmute? I think
Loveline, yes, Loveline, you can unmute. Can you unmute yourself? Loveline.
I don't have the way to unmute her. I'd have to ask her to unmute.
Yes.
All right, go ahead, Loveline. Let's see what you say. Go ahead.
Okay. Okay, given that I'm a logged in user, when I get, when I click, given I'm a logged in user, when I get to my profile, given that I'm a logged in user, when I click on the post button, I should be able to type a comment. I should be able to type a message and send.
Yes, but way too vague. There's some more details. So I want you guys to build on what others have said, right? Not to repeat it. So the first part that the first, I don't remember her name, said, she said, given that I'm a login user, I'll be able to click on create post. And so now I want you guys to continue on where she left off. So what else? When you click on create post, being able to create a post is too big. It doesn't isolate the things that you're looking at on the screen, because you have to tell the developers exactly what to build. If you say create a post, they could just give you a text box and they're done. You can create your post now, but if you need to tell them exactly what they need to build so that it matches what we're looking at on the screen. So I see a lot of hands going up. Let's just pick one at random. Doris, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if this is specific enough. I would say, given that I am a user, I should be able to post. I should be able to post, and everyone should be able to see my my post. I don't know. Given that I'm okay, no, not specific enough.
Too generic, too generic. So I want you to build, right? Build on what's already said. So we've already gotten to the point where you're now able to create a post. But what about the fact that you're seeing my icon here? The developer doesn't know that you need to show an icon. You need to tell him. How does he know what to put on the screen? All right, let's go with who's on camera. Let's see. I can't see your name. Felwa, go ahead, Felwa.
Thanks. As a user,
good try though. So we'll just keep adding to it. Go ahead, Felwa.
okay, sure. I'll give it a try. So whatever as a user I write before clicking post should show after.
What I write before clicking post should show after.
Yes, it should be like exact same.
Yes, that's a part of the acceptance criteria, but still not full. Go ahead, Lanry, you're next. But good try, good try. Good.
All right, I should be given the option to post once I'm done typing.
Yes, that's kind of a lot of what was said before. Yes. What I want you guys to focus on is this is all they gave you. And you need to put everything that you're looking at as acceptance criteria for developers to go build. It means that at the end of all of this, yes, you're going to post so others can see it. That's correct. But how do they know how to build these exact things is what I want to get at. What are the individual acceptance criteria that you'd have to say? So first you're going to say, oh, sorry, let me plug my computer in. I see it's telling me that I'm low on battery. Sorry guys, hold on. All right, good, that we won't get cut off. So in other words, when I'm looking at this story and I say, as a user, I want to be able to post, when I'm on the post screen, the system must show this, the system must do this, the user is able to do this. Like, that's the kind of thing I want to hear. I'm going to take two more, then I'm going to give the answer. All right, Chloe, go ahead. I think other people have been holding their hands for a while. I'm sorry, I'm just randomly picking. So sorry.
Yeah.
First. All right, go ahead, Chloe.
Yeah, I'm just gonna try. So as a user, I want to be able to add photos to post. That's the only one I recognize at the bottom. I don't know if that one is sharp, but I'm not sure. But
Well,
it looks like
said, yeah, yes, you want to be able to add photos. All right, let's go real quick. Yinka, what do you want to add? I'm gonna get to all of you. I swear, I'm gonna try. Yinka.
Yeah, so I wanted to say to be able to add to my post and to be able to change the text.
You mean this icon right here?
Yes, correct.
The user must be able to see an icon that will allow them to change the background color of the post. So
correct, yeah.
That's one acceptance criteria. Go ahead. Very good. Ogichi, I hope I'm saying it right. Ogichi, go ahead. What do you want to add?
Yeah, hi, Kara.
Hi.
So sorry, I'm somewhere that I can't share my
That's
my
okay.
video. So, all right. So to write a user story for this scenario, I would say as a registered Facebook user, when I type in my post, I should be able to be. I should have the option to click on the post icon so that my post will show on the dashboard.
Yes, but if that is all your user story says, you've missed out a lot of it. You've missed. So the story is good, the format you're saying, but your acceptance criteria, if I were to test that, it wouldn't match what I'm looking at. That's what I'm saying. Like the acceptance criteria has to be a little bit more fleshed out, if that makes sense. All right, Odiong. I'm saying it
Yeah,
right.
you've done well. Odi will help.
Okay.
So mine was actually the acceptance criteria for the first user story, and that was going to be given that I am on my page after logging in. When I type a text, it should be able to show something like that. Then it should be able to show on my page.
Yes, same problem. It's too vague. Type in the text and have it show on your page. We agree that is a part of the acceptance criteria. I accept that. That's true. But what I want to get at is, if I were to write a user story with only that, would that accomplish the screen? Right?
No.
Cameron, I can't see your name. Go ahead. I can't see your name. Just go ahead. Gray shirt. Go ahead.
Me?
Yes, there you are. Tell me your
Okay.
name. I'm mute. I don't know. Zoom is not showing me your name for some reason.
Yeah, my name is Mandeep.
right,
So, okay. As a registered user, I should be able to click on a cross button so that I should cancel my post. Because
you're putting the acceptance criteria for this, correct? Yes. So if you guys missed this one, this would be an acceptance criteria too. All right, good. So we're missing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're missing 5 acceptance criteria so far. Okay, moving on.
Can I do one more?
Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
As a registered user, I should be able to get an option to change my privacy for the post, so that I can create a public or private. Yeah, this one.
So
the one.
Remember, it's one user story. This would typically, it could be more than one user story, but for this purpose, I'm going to say it's one user story. So that as a user, I should be able to create a post so that I can share it with my friends. That's the user story.
Okay.
The criteria is I should be able to see a button that allows me to close if I decide not to continue. There's a button that with an X that allows me to cancel. There is an option to, the system will show an option to change the privacy. And privacy options are public, private, friends only, blah, blah, blah. And then other acceptance criteria that nobody has mentioned. Well, somebody mentioned this one. I will be able to see an icon. Doesn't matter what that looks like, on the title, your UI elements. But I should be able to see an icon that allows me to change the background color of my post. So we've covered this, we've covered this, we've covered this, and somebody said being able to add an image, but they didn't flesh it out too well. It should be able to add an image by seeing the add to post bar at the footer of my page, and be able to see an icon that says that, that allows me to add an image from my system. I'm gonna take only 2 more because we gotta move on. I don't know who's been holding the longest. I'm sorry if I missed you, but let's go with Aduki. Aduki, do you want to go? Go ahead.
Hello, as a user, I should be able to put a simile or icon, emoji icon on my post.
Is that what this is right here?
No. Yes.
Emoji. All right, so I'm going to tell you the rest. I know people are waiting, but we got to move on. So as a user, I will be able to create a post so that I can share it with my friends. That's my user story. My acceptance criteria will be, given that I'm a logged in user, I should be able to see an option for that says create post. I'll be able to see my avatar and my username as I'm logged in. I'll be able to change the public setting of my post. I'll be able to see a placeholder text. Nobody mentioned this, it was right in your face. A placeholder text that says write something to and the name of the logged in user with 3 dots behind it, right? I'll be able to see an icon that allows me to change the color, the background color of my post. And I'll also be able to see a footer of my post that allows me to pick an option for a video. I don't even remember what this was. And this COVID option and 3 dots. Now, each of these individually could be a separate story. So this would say, okay, when I click on this, a separate story will handle how you attach the videos or posts or go live or whatever the options are. But the story for this would be able to show everything that you're seeing on the screen, right? So you can't boil it all up into, okay, you're able to post and see to your friends. What does that mean for the developer? They're very detailed. They're in the weeds. So you have to tell them what you need to build in the story. And then you attach the screenshot so they can see what it looks like, where it's placed. Possibly they'll have details at the dimensions of the modal, all the little fine details, it has to be fleshed out, right? So your job in the user story is to tell them that these are all the things that needs to be in the post. Why are you doing that? Because when the QA comes to test, they got to say, okay, I see create post check. I see this X check. I see the avatar check. I see Karaleise check. I see the public option check. I see this placeholder text check. I see this option check. If you didn't put it, they can't confirm that it's working, right? Whatever you get is what you get. It might not look like this. And then the story wouldn't be good. So great exercise. Thank you for everyone. I know we still had a few people who didn't get to, I apologize. But yeah, this is a good exercise for us to see how you take an actual design and create user stories from it. All right, so we are very much out of time, but I'm just gonna run through two things. I think we're gonna go over, Osita, if people can stay a little bit. We're gonna go over the time, but I think it's worth it to just finish the concept. So here are some real world projects that I've worked on that include user stories in Jira, right? So let's talk about them for a minute. So there were two projects that I worked on that I thought really was helpful to the user base. So one of them we call it the Action Plan Project, and the other one is called the Land and Expand Project. These were both projects that were geared at salespeople. So the Action Plan Project was a task management feature that we were building, and it had integrated features. So you could create tasks in this tool, and it would send it to Salesforce. Salesforce was the main CRM that we were integrated with, but we also integrated with others like Microsoft Dynamics, Sugar CRM, all kinds of CRM, but mainly our customers were using, for the most part, Salesforce. So we would create these tasks that was geared around sales activities, and then they could push it to Salesforce and have it all integrated and synced. It addressed the needs of account managers. So imagine you're going up for, you're working with a sales organization and you're trying to sell to billion-dollar companies, and you're trying to strategize around how to win this deal. So you have an account is what you've already sold to. You have an opportunity, which means that these are qualified leads that could buy from you, right? So how do you confirm, how do you make sure you get that deal? It's very competitive, right? They have to have tasks, they have to do demos, they have to send care packages, they do all kinds of stuff to try to get the deal. You guys have dealt with salespeople before, you know how aggressive they can be. And imagine at a scale of billions of dollars. So they're really aggressive going after these deals, and they need to be able to track all the activities that the sales teams are doing in order to get that opportunity converted to an actual account, right? That was the Action Plan Project. The other project was Land and Expand. So once you have actually gotten them to sign and they are now a client, how do you keep getting money out of them? Because the purpose of you doing business is to make money, right? So what was happening was the salespeople would have all these ideas to grow the account, right? We're gonna try to upsell them this thing, they have this need over here, they have a project that's already funded that we could sell our tool into, all that stuff. But they didn't want to put it into Salesforce or whatever their CRM was, because once they create that opportunity in Salesforce, and all of a sudden all the managers are looking at it, and then there's some reporting, and now you got to be accountable, and if you didn't make the sale, then it's like you're not doing a good job, and it was just too much. So they would keep their ideas in Excel sheets, they would keep it in their task management, Todoist or whatever, or even their Outlook. And when they had to do a report to their managers, they couldn't remember all the ideas that they had, and they couldn't pull it all together to give a good picture of what they're doing to grow revenue in that account. So that was their dilemma. So they needed a place where they could nurture their ideas without having all this oversight, and it becomes a part of a pipeline, and now they got to be accountable for it, and it's just way too much pressure, when all it was just an idea. You had an idea to get $1 billion from this company, you put $1 billion in Salesforce, it becomes a part of a report, all of a sudden you didn't make $1 billion, now it's like you didn't make the sale, and now you got to be accountable. So nobody wanted to do that, right? So those are the two projects. So imagine a sales team that has like 30 members, a huge sales team. How do you make sure that all the tasks that everybody has to do to be able to win the deal is being managed properly, and that they can brainstorm and work collaboratively in our tool, right? So that's what the tool did. And once you landed that account, How do you keep growing? How do you keep growing revenue? How do you help keep them giving you money year over year? Those are the two challenges that we're facing. So the action plan project, when we had our discussion, because again, remember we talk about user stories. When we had our discussion, we understood a few problems from our client base. One was that the way our tool was, only one user could be in there at a time. So I'd be in there, let's say you're in a big room, a big conference room, you're all brainstorming ideas, it's very fluid, it's going fast. And I'm in there trying to capture these as tasks. Okay, create a demo, you know, call the CEO, do all these things. But somebody else needs to add some other tasks, but they got to say, hey, Karaleise, are you in the task? Okay, come out so I can go in. And they're like, oh, Peter, wait, I'm trying to finish up. Let me save here and then you can go in. So the collaboration was disrupted, you know, we couldn't do things fluidly because only one person could be in at a time. The people didn't like our tool for that purpose. It impeded the brainstorming process because it can't be fluid. You got to wait for somebody and disrupt the thought pattern that we were having. Not easy collaboration for sure. And sometimes if I didn't save, I'm trying to jump out, I didn't click the save button, now I lost all my changes. And ideas are some things that you can't get them again. Like the idea was just fresh and good, you can't even repeat it. So when you lose that momentum, it's hard to get it back. And if you didn't click save, you could lose all the work that you were just doing. That was a big pain. So the two solutions we came up with was allow multi-user capability. So all of us can be in there at the same time without losing our changes or overriding each other, and allow auto save. So I don't need to click on this big save button to save things. Nowadays, it's very common, like if you're using these collaborative tools, but in our tool, we didn't have the auto save or we didn't have multi-user capability. So that was the solution that we came up with. So here are some questions that came out of the discussion with our development team when we talked about, you know, we want to do auto save, we want to do multi-user. Some of the questions that the team came back with was how to let users know who is editing what. So yeah, all of us are in there, but how do I know that I'm editing and Osita is editing at the same time? How do I prevent him from overriding me? How to prevent deleting. So our tool was like a tree hierarchy. So here you have tasks, but those tasks boil up to an objective. That objective boil up to a goal. So the goal is to win the account, right? But you have these objectives that you have to meet. How do I know that if I delete this top level tier, it doesn't delete all of its children, right? So that you're not working in the child and then somebody deletes the parent and now everything is all messed up. How to handle connection loss. So I'll be in there working and my computer internet goes out and I think I'm still connected, I'm keep working. And then while I'm offline, somebody else changes something that I was working on. And now when I come back online, how do you make sure it doesn't get all janked up, right? So some of those challenges. How to handle integration. So while we are creating these tasks in our tool, it's automatically sending it to Salesforce to sync it to Salesforce. So how do you make sure that sync continues while multiple people are editing possibly the same task at the same time? So those are some of the questions that come out. And when you have discussions, these are the things that will come out that you wouldn't think about on your own. Like if I was sitting in my own little silo writing this user story, I wouldn't think about connection loss necessarily. That's just something that dev thinks about because they are so in the weeds with how the technology works. I wouldn't think about necessarily real-time integration. I'd say it needs to be integrated to Salesforce and I'm done. But I'm not thinking about how often the API is calling and polling and all this stuff. I wouldn't think about that stuff. This is the reason why you need to have discussions with your team to finalize the acceptance criteria because they know things that you are not gonna know. So here's an example of the user story that was written around some of this. This is just one of the ones I pulled from the project at random. So this one handled prevent user from deleting action plan item if it is being edited by another user. So when you write user stories in Jira, you want the user story title to be very telling. It normally starts with a verb. You're doing some action, you're preventing something, you're allowing something, you're giving the ability to do something so that as they look at the user stories in the backlog, they can pick out which ones is doing what without having to open them, right? So the title of the story has to say what the body of the user story is doing so you can easily identify, the product owner can easily prioritize, and it's just a better way. It's a short, compact title that explains what's happening in the user story, and it starts normally with a verb. So here we have the format fleshed out inside the user story. Here's the user story part of it. Here's the acceptance criteria, and this one is in Jerkin format. So you see I've said, given that I am on the action plan, when I am editing the task, then another user cannot delete the parent that I am editing, blah, blah, blah. So it's a given action, given when then situation, right? So in our case, we found that sometimes we would write this is what I was saying about having the acceptance criteria, right? So in that example with Facebook, you'd have maybe 5 or 6 acceptance criteria for each of the things that was on that Facebook screen, for the closing, for the placeholder text, for the public, for the images at the bottom, like all of that would be acceptance criteria that lends itself to testing whether or not the user story has been done successfully. In this case, we wrote the user story, and you see we have this word verified here. So what we found that worked for us, and you can come up with your own, convention, is that once we have done with the story and the developer says it's QA ready, the QA person goes in and tests each individual line. And as they test each individual line, they put the word verified to say, okay, we tested, it works. We tested, it works. We tested, it works, right? And that is the reason why you have to make your acceptance criteria very detailed and individual so they can test it. So if this was a Facebook post and the screenshot had that smiley, for example, and the user story didn't have the smiley, then the QA can come and say, well, this doesn't really match because, the screenshot had something that the story doesn't have, and it could be you that didn't write it, right? You could have been the person at fault. Maybe it's not the developer's fault, but something is wrong, right? Because the acceptance criteria isn't there. Somebody's raising their hand. Let me see what they want to say. Babalola, go ahead, Babalola. Or was it from before? Maybe.
Sorry, that was from before.
Okay, no problem. All right. So yeah, so this is what the user story looks like for this particular example. Let's keep going. So we talked about the convention that we were using at our company. It doesn't mean every company does this, but we found that it worked for us. Now, when they did a story or an acceptance criteria that did not match, like it failed, right? With what they tested didn't match what the user story said, then they would put failed. Now we had the convention of putting the date that it failed, and this is the bug they created for that, and then they put the link to the bug. Now, some people put this in the comments, some people, just link the bug in the story. But we found that when we see that, okay, everything worked, but this one didn't work, it really calls attention to the developer to say, okay, this is the problem, as opposed to scrolling, looking in the comments, trying to figure out, okay, where exactly the problem is. It was very clear to them where the problem is. And if they want to see more about that problem, they simply click on the link, it takes them to the bug, and everything was very fluid that way. We found that process worked a lot for us. So that's how we were indicating when something failed in testing and when something was verified. Here's another example. This is an example of a spike story. So in this case, we wanted to do something that we didn't know how to do. We had no idea how to do this, but we know we needed to do it. So it says, research how to prevent action plan from displacing users while multiple users are editing. What would happen was multiple people are now able to go in. We've written that story, they developed that. But I could be at the bottom typing something, and then somebody deletes a row at the top, and all of a sudden my screen jumped. And I was here, and all of a sudden I'm placed here. And it was very jarring, very disruptive. So we're like, okay, this is not a good user experience. But we didn't know exactly how to fix it, right? How to prevent that from happening. We know we got to fix it, but how? Nobody knows. So that's where you create a spike story. And a spike story doesn't have too much detail. It really just says, here's the problem, research how to solve this and present the findings to the team, right? And we gave them like a 2-day time box to do that. Some spike stories have acceptance criteria. In this case, we didn't have any because it's just how do you prevent it? Like, that's the only thing. So sometimes you can put spike at the beginning so people can know when they're looking at it in the backlog that this is a spike story. But this is what I mean by spike. It means we don't know exactly what to do to solve this problem, but we have to go research, we have to go find out in order to come up with the best set of solutions. And then we can create a story that can be estimated when we do that, right? All right, so real quick, the land and expand project. I know we're over time, but I'm just gonna run through this. We're probably gonna go over maybe another 20 minutes. So here's the other one that talked about land and expand. So with the land and expand project, the challenge that we were facing in this project was that our systems only handle accounts and opportunities. So the users could only manage accounts and opportunities. So it had to be like you already sold to the person, or you're in pursuit of some opportunity. But there were ideas to get opportunities. Where does those lie? They're not really an opportunity yet, but they're an idea for one. It's still valuable, but we didn't have a place to nurture that, right? So ideas to grow revenue in the account were in the heads of different salespeople, not on any system anywhere, and we couldn't really track or manage it. Account managers, they didn't want to put it into Salesforce to be accountable for it or in any other CRM. And so they were having multiple Excel sheets, multiple chat conversations, multiple tasks all over the place. And when their management said, okay, what are you doing to grow revenue in this account? It was like madhouse to try and pull it from all these different places. And sometimes they'll have it in their heads. Sometimes they'll forget all of the things that they had in their heads. It was just hard for them to manage. So we decided to come up with a feature to help them manage the ideas to grow revenue without the oversight or the pressure of having to be accountable for it. So that's what we came up with. So when we had our discussions around this, some of the things that came out of that discussion was how to help the users see what stage their idea was in. So for example, I could have an idea to sell $5 million worth of stuff to BMW company, for example. But this is just an idea at this point. I haven't called anyone. I don't know if they have a project that's funded. I haven't vetted it in any way. So how do I differentiate that idea that's in a beginning stage from an idea where I've talked to the CEO, they've agreed that they want to do a demo, that they think that this would be valuable for them. And now it's like almost an opportunity that I could start, chasing down. I mean, I'm not a salesperson, but you get the idea. So how to help them see the different stages of their ideas, how to help manage to see what activities they need to do. So all the stuff that we need to do, we need to call, we need to do a demo, we need to set up a meeting, we need to send them LinkedIn requests, we need to do research on the company, whatever we need to do, where are those tasks and who is doing them? How do we help them see that? How do you help users convert an idea to an actual opportunity? How do they, if they've done all this work in the idea stage, now it's a vetted idea, it's a good idea, it's valuable, it's qualified. How do you easily move that into the place where they actually manage the opportunities without them having to rekey things? How to manage a task without having tasks for your ideas and tasks for your actual account plan. So it's not like 2 task lists that you got to struggle between. And how do you help them see at a glance how much revenue they can potentially get out of this account from the ideas that they have, right? So that was a challenge and some of the questions that we came up with. Here's a user story from that. This is just one on cloning. So you basically had an idea that was great, and now you want to copy it, but you don't want to have to individually write it over. You want to copy it with all of its tasks, all of the information that was around it. And now, how do we make that easy? We call this feature clone. And so this was ability to clone, land and expand ideas. So here's my user story, right? As a user, I want to be able to clone an LNE idea from the plan object so that I can create a duplicate and I don't have to rekey information. So the value is that I don't have to rekey, that's the value to the user. And here are all the things that we had to do for that. Now, if you notice, we have this change here. This was another one of our conventions. So whenever there's a change to the story, so in this case, I wrote the story, we talked about the story, we had a discussion, I updated the story based on the discussion, went into the sprint, was wonderful, it's in the sprint. Sometime during that 2 weeks that we locked off for the sprint, the product owner made a change or something happened and we said, oh, well, we have to change the story. So typically when that happens, I contact the developer who's working on it and say, hey, here's a change that we have to make in the sprint. We try to minimize changes in the sprint, but sometimes things happen. Here's a change we want to make in the sprint. Have you started working on the story? Should it be a new story? Because if you've already started working on it, I don't want to disrupt what you've already done. It could be that he's at the end of the sprint and he's already done with that, moving on. I don't want to have to redo everything. So sometimes I create a new story, depending on what the change is. And sometimes it's early enough that he says, I haven't even looked at it yet, go ahead and make the change. So in this case, that was the case. So I just put the word change here. And then we put what the change is, remove the old acceptance criteria, put the word here, so that when he looks at the story the next time, he can say, oh, this has changed. Now I need to go reevaluate or re-estimate and update that, right? We have that discussion before anyway, but this is the result of writing it out after we've talked about it. So you don't just change things and throw it over the wall again, right? If you're gonna make a change, you gotta talk to the developer. You probably gotta go re-estimate, see how it impacts the current sprint, get the product owner involved if you need to, so that you don't end up, putting the sprint at risk for not being finished, right? That's what we use and we found it to be helpful. Last one, so Here are some other examples where we had to make several changes in the same story and we put the change there. And here's some notes for QA. So sometimes based on your changes, you need to tell QA how to test, right? So we made some notes here so that when QA gets into test, they know what to test for. And in this example, when they were done, they put verified and it just worked out well for us. All right. That is actually what I had to talk to you guys about. That is the end of my presentation. I hope this was informative. I hope it was helpful. I hope I shed some light on do's and don'ts for user stories, best practices for user stories, helps you to kind of put yourself in the world of Agile a little bit and get yourself more familiar with how to do user stories in Jira. So I know we're over time, but I will spare a few minutes if you guys want to stay to talk a little bit about any questions that you have. I know the chat is like bubbling. Yeah, so Kemi, you want to help me with some of these questions? I don't think we can do all of them, but let's see how much we can get in the next, looks like 19 minutes.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much, Kara. We have become user story specialists even. We have a couple of questions in the chat box, and thank you, Prof. Jexy. I see you've been trying to help with some of the questions, so I believe we should be able to answer, the unanswered ones within the time frame that we have. So I have a question here that says, what's the difference between requirements and needs? So actually we had two questions. One says the difference between requirements and acceptance criteria, and another says between requirements and needs. Prof. Jexy actually put in something for the difference between requirements and acceptance criteria. So we can take the difference between requirements and needs.
All right, so requirements and acceptance criteria. It's a common question I get a lot. And it seems like the two should be the same, right? It feels like, okay, a requirement is just an acceptance criteria and with acceptance criteria is a requirement. And in some cases they are the same, but the acceptance criteria is really testable. It's things that you can test to confirm the user story. So it's more specific, I would say, a little bit to the development process, whereas a requirement could be something just more generic for your business. So for example, the business requirement for me to be able to withdraw money from my bank account is that I need to present my ID and I need to present my bank card. That is a requirement for the business. However, if I'm building a software, that may not be a part of my acceptance criteria. My acceptance criteria will be that the teller is able to, create a checkbox that confirms that they saw the ID or something like that, right? So the business requirement or the requirement itself is really all of the kind of the business rules for how they want to do business, which may or may not translate into actual acceptance criteria for software development. Hope that was clear. Yeah. All right, the other one was about business requirements, acceptance criteria and needs. Was that true?
Business requirements and needs.
Business requirements and needs. I don't know if there's really a strong difference between them. I haven't really thought through that one. So the business requirements and the business rules are very tied, right? And that's usually driven by the needs of the business. The business, for example, needs to be compliant. It has to match these government compliance. These are all the things that has to happen for the business to exist. The business rules could be what the company decides that this is how we want to do business, right? We could say we have to be compliant to the government, that's a need, but in our environment, we want the users to, let's say this is a bank, to be able to, let's say the company, the government says you have to get a disclosure letter, let's say it's a HMDA. You got to get a disclosure letter in 3 days, right? That's the legal rule. And maybe the business requirement is that we want to be so proactive that we want to send the letter in 1 day, right? So this is how we do business. It's really, the need is more enforced on them, sometimes by external forces or maybe by themselves. But the requirement is how do they want to do business within that umbrella. I hope that's clear. But it's like the need can be exactly the same as the requirement, or the requirement could be a more confined way of accomplishing that need.
Awesome. Thank you, Kara. I have another question here. Is there any specific way to write user stories for API integration projects? Someone asked it, okay, yeah. So that's the question. Is there any specific way to write user stories for API integration projects?
Yeah. The challenge with the API is that it's a backend thing, right? It's backend to backend. It's just data that's being pushed from one place to the next. And you definitely just making API calls, and there might not be an interface to display that. So at the end of the day, it really depends on your organization. So again, you own your methodology. You don't have to stick to whatever the book says. You can come up with your own conventions and decide how you're going to do it. The best practice, though, is that when you're writing backend stories, that there is still some benefit to the user. So you can tie it back to the user. So I want to get this data from this API to that API for what reason? Who benefits from it? Who is going to get, what is the end result after you do all of that? And that's how you write the user story. I want to be able to transfer this data from this API to that API so that the user can create the application, so the user can get this value in their process. What is the end result of this backend to backend thing? So you really still have to make sure it has some value. Otherwise, why are you doing it? The systems themselves don't have value, right? Being able to call an API and pass a value for the system's benefit, that's not enough. What is the user's benefit? Who is consuming this at the end of the day? Why did you do it? Because at the end of the day, there's a customer somewhere who's going to benefit and going to pay you money for it. Who is that customer? Why are you doing it for them? So always, even if it's a backend story, you still have to find a way to figure out how it's beneficial to the user, so you can have that input to make sure you're doing the right thing as well.
Awesome, thank you. I have another one. Is there any relation to Spike and Epic?
Not necessarily. Remember, Epic is more at a higher level. It's more like a feature. It's a body of work that's going to result in this feature, right? So the Epic has user stories below it. A Spike is just a type of user story. The only difference between a Spike and a regular user story is that it can be estimated because you don't know how to do it. Spike is really about the research, uncovering unknowns, and they give you a time box to get that done. You may or may not have an acceptance criteria, but it's essentially a user story. And user story is typically boiled up to an epic. The epic is at the higher level, and below the epic are all these user stories that help to fulfill this epic, right? So there isn't really a direct connection between an epic and a Spike. They're drawing conclusions that don't need to be drawn, right? There's no direction. There's no direct result of comparing an epic with a Spike. A Spike is really just a user story.
Okay, thank you. I have another one. I'm about to transition from discovery team to delivery team, where I'll be required to write user stories. What should I expect as I go into the new role?
So I don't know what discovery team means in your organization, but if you've not been writing user stories before, if you've been doing something else, and now you're transitioning into an agile environment where you're going to be writing user stories, I think one of the best thing is to understand how do they do their agile, right? Because every team is doing their own thing kind of, and they have their kind of conventions. So you want to understand how they do things. If it's a whole new team that everybody's new to it, that's great because now you can help to influence it. But if they already have a culture, they already have a method of doing things, try to figure out what those things are. Like, are they having 2-week sprints, or is it 3-week sprints? Is it 1-week sprints? How often do you need to prepare the stories? You know, what's with the product owner, who prioritizes the stories? What do the stories look like right now? Because it could be that they're not using the format that's recommended. Maybe they're using some other thing. And you, having had this training with me, can now recommend, okay, this is how we should be writing user stories, and you can add that value to them. So try to find out the culture and how they're doing things. And then as you're starting to write user stories, remember, it's a team effort. Don't be afraid to make a stab at it. You don't know everything. You don't know all of the things, but make a stab at it. And then the concept is that you're going to help you, you're going to leverage the team to refine it, right? Don't beat yourself up if you don't know everything. You're not supposed to know everything, right? The team comes together, and together they make the best decision as a team. So make a stab at it, you know, put the stories out there, have the conversations, create those meetings, talk to your product owner, and together you guys will refine the user stories together. And that will be probably the best approach that you could take for transitioning from something else into this new role.
Thank you, Kara. I think we'll take just 2 more questions. So I have one here. Can the acceptance criteria contain UI elements?
So typically, you want to avoid too much, unless you're redoing the UI. If you have a project where the project purpose is to redo the UI, then that's fine. But typically, you want to avoid UI elements. Why? Because if you work with UX teams, and I've worked with a lot of them, they're constantly changing the UI. They are always changing the colors. Sometimes a button makes sense here, and then they rethink it. Okay, it shouldn't be a button, it should be a drop down. Sometimes they, the table was at the top, no, the table's at the bottom. Sometimes the table has sort arrows, sometimes it doesn't. And they've made changes, little small things, because they want to help the user to have a good experience. You don't want to have to go and change your user story every time they make a little edit to the UI. So you want to start using words like there is an option the user is able to, without specifying exactly what option that is. It's a button. It's a, it's an arrow. You really want to try to be as generic about the UI element as possible, so that you're not constantly having rework. So that's the general rule. Now, if you're doing a project where all the project is to redo the UI, you still should have, you could mention some UI elements in there, but typically that's not the project, right? Typically you're just documenting the functionality, and the UI is added to the user story as an additional piece of information that the developers can look at. So I would stay away from UI elements in the user story as a general rule.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kara. So we have a few more questions. I'm just going to take one more question. Our email is going to be shared on the chat box. Kara has agreed that, if you send these questions to her, she's going to make out time to respond to all your questions, and we'll send that back to you. So please, if I don't get to your question, just send an email with your question, and we're going to get the answers for you. So the final question today: at what point during the sprint does the spike story feature, considering that it's also time boxed?
What point during the sprint? It's a part of your sprint planning. So when the product owner prioritizes the items for the sprint, one of those items could be your spike story. And when you get in there, it becomes a part of the sprint planning. Now, typically it's time boxed, so there's not an estimate. You can't really say how many story points it is. So it does create some level of uncertainty as to how many story points this is. But the time box is there to make sure you don't spend the entire sprint researching it, right? So once that time box is done, now you have a story that they can estimate, right? So it's we're kind of agreeing that this person is going to be engaged in an activity that doesn't really have a story point attached to it, but it has a time attached to it, and it's normally done during the sprint discussion.
Awesome.
Sometimes, just to add to that, sometimes you have spike stories that can be estimated. It's weird. Sometimes you do have spike stories that can be estimated. For example, if they need to do a proof of concept. So it's like, okay, we're going to research which widget is the best to use for this data set. And we know, regardless of whichever widget we use, it's gonna be maybe a 5 story point just to do the research. And sometimes in your estimation, you buffer in estimation points because you don't know, for the uncertainty, for the fact that you don't know, right? So there are cases where you do put some estimation point that adds to the total number for the sprint, for your velocity. But it's kind of rare to do that. Typically the spike stories you don't know, so you don't really have an estimation point.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kara.
Yeah, again, this is your methodology, right? You can change it and make it work for your team. It's not something set in stone that you can't, you have to follow the book with.
Okay, so thank you so much, Kara.
Awesome.
Yeah. On this note, I'm going to, okay, yes. I got a couple of questions about the material for this masterclass. We are going to make that available, the recording, to everyone that attended today. So, and
yes,
on this,
I'll put this, maybe I'm not sure yet, but maybe I'll embed this on my website so you can go back to the slides. For the recording, I think Kemi will share for sure.
Awesome. Yeah, so on this note, I'd like to hand over to Ugo Njoku. If you could please take over from here.
Wow. Good evening, everyone. And very special thanks to everyone who's made out the time to be here today.